Hello. In episode 4 of Heirs for Architecture's third series, I spoke with Stuart Vokes and Aaron Peters of Brisbane architects Vokes and Peters about their practice and design work, particularly their residential building in Brisbane's suburbs, and their recent book, Migrations from Memory, published by Canalside Press this year.
Heirs for Architecture, a podcast about architecture, buildings, urban culture and space.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Heirs for Architecture. I'm talking today to Vokes and Peters, Aaron Peters and Stu Vokes from Brisbane, architects extraordinaire, about their book, Migrations from Memory, published by Canalside Press. Stu, Aaron, would you like to introduce yourself? Be so kind as to introduce yourselves? Individually and as a practice, I suppose.
Yes, good evening, Ambrose. Thanks very much for having us. I'm Stuart Vokes. I'm what you'd call the senior partner of our practice. Aaron is a lot younger than me. He's sitting next to me. We met when in 2003 when Aaron was a student of architecture, and I happened to be tutoring in his design class, and we really struck a chord, and I invited Aaron to come and do some work with us, and well, he never left, really.
I'm Aaron. I'm the junior partner, which I think given the amount of hair that you have compared to me, I'm not quite sure that stands any longer. Yes, I had the good fortune to meet Stuart in my third year design class, and he took me back to his studio and indoctrinated me into his worldview. And I did leave briefly. I got away for 3 years and lived and worked overseas for a little while. But in 2011, I came back, and we've been practicing together ever since.
So what's this worldview? What is the worldview? What is the worldview you got him saturated in, or has it developed over time?
Yeah, I think the practice and the collaboration and what's been now a 20-year conversation for Aaron and I, it's really been a journey of discovery, I think, which is really like describing life, I think, and it's describing a friendship that you kind of go through life together, and you discover things about your work and about cities and about things that you admire, that you both like. I think that's really important for a friendship and for a partnership. But I think more importantly, maybe it's my age speaking, but I think we also, it's been a journey of discovering ourselves, and I think that's really important for an architect. We would probably describe ourselves as being mid-career practitioners, and I think you would hope that by the time you get to that juncture in your practice life, that you would know more about yourself and know more about your work. I think that's becoming evident and critical as we move forward from here.
I don't think practicing was ever it was never just a job for us. And I know a lot of architects are like that, but it's a way of life, and it becomes eventually how you see yourself, I think. And of course that can be both healthy and unhealthy, but for us, we're definitely predisposed to want to, as Stu used to put it, find a place to dwell in architecture, and part of that meant finding people to dwell with in architecture. So as a third year student, just before I met Stu, I was starting to think about a year out and finding a job, and I remember being desperate to find either mentors or peers, colleagues who could go on that journey with me. And so I met Stu really at the perfect time for me. And, not only is Stu's 11 years older than I am, so he'd built a few buildings and had a bit more confidence about who he was and what he liked and what he wanted to do. And I was so incredibly primed and receptive to meet someone with that skill set. And I think that's what started us on the journey, was just being able to embark on a conversation about architecture, and eventually that spills over into life. And so it's gone on for 20 years now.
Yeah.
It's a very elegant way of putting it. And I really like this idea of using practice as a way of discovering yourself, rather than just being a sort of commercial activity, a thing that you do, but really an exploration of identity. And your architecture has that quality about it. But perhaps we could talk a little bit about where you are. I mean, you're in Brisbane, obviously, in Australia, in Queensland, and I mean, that's very central, from what I gather from your book and looking at your projects, very central to the kind of work that you do.
Yeah, I think that's definitely correct. Maybe just a few words on Brisbane to start off with. So Brisbane is a subtropical city. We're located about 1,000 kilometres north of Sydney, on the east coast of Australia. So a fair drive. Brisbane's, I guess, Australia's third largest city, I think. And the last 30 years have been one of exponential growth in the city. Traditionally, Brisbane was not an impoverished city, but it definitely lagged behind Sydney and Melbourne in terms of its economy, and a lot of the natural resources that were being exploited here, that the profits were going south rather than into Brisbane. So Brisbane, was always a bit of a big country town. It had that vibe about it. But in the last 30 years, that's really changed. And, we've seen a growing level of affluence in our town. So we have both this really quite interesting building tradition and vernacular housing stock in particular, built from almost entirely from timber. These houses called the Queenslander, which is quite remarkable, and they're situated on quite large suburban lots. So the suburbs are really characterised by the presence of these houses with their pointy tin roofs. If you've seen Bluey, Bluey is set in Brisbane. That's the current reference for anyone outside of Brisbane. And also this verdant vegetation, big fruit trees, and lots of green space, or at least that's what it was traditionally. So the context in which we've been practicing has been in the midst of this quite rapid change, where we're seeing a whole wave of immigration from southern states growing. So the population has been booming, lots of money flowing into the city, and with that comes a huge amount of change in the built fabric.
Yeah, it's almost like for the entire period of our 20-year collaboration, the city's been under massive renovation, particularly in the residential sphere, which is predominantly, where we work. I guess we've seen this affluence growing in the city, and it just means that, and this appetite for homeowners to want to buy a building and immediately renovate the building. They're renovating in the inner city of Brisbane. They're renovating all of the historic timber stock, and these buildings are just so agile. These lightly framed timber they're almost like instruments sitting up on legs above the topography, which can be put on the back of a truck and moved down the street, or moved interstate and resurrected on stumps. You can get underneath them and work on all of the services. You can get in their roofs. They're really agile and adaptable. So it's almost like the housing stock of the city is really primed for all kinds of intervention. Often good and sadly often terrible. But it means for 20 years we've been receiving commissions from these homeowners with a request to extend or alter or adapt these timber buildings. So, I mean, in a lot of ways, your practice becomes a product of the commissions that you accept, or not even the commissions that we accept, but the commissions that come to us, I guess. And then how it is in practice, that if you do 10, the next commission you get is always going to be the same as the last 10 commissions that you got, which is a good and a bad thing, I guess. But it's meant that we've worked on numerous timber houses in the hundreds now, I guess. And I guess it's allowed us to kind of slowly develop a sensibility and an empathy for these buildings, to truly understand how it is that we might reoccupy these buildings, which is a sort of phrase that we like to use to explain, maybe in summary, how it is that we approach the alterations to these buildings. So yeah, there's this abundance of commissions, and it's almost become a kind of form of research funded by our clients. Fantastic, really. I think a real privilege.
Is that a good level of situating, Ambrose?
Yeah, no, it's really good. I mean, I think, yeah, from here, you know, you hear about Sydney, you hear about Melbourne. You don't hear so much about Brisbane. But I'm kind of interested in this idea that is it going through a process of gentrification, would you say? Is it that kind of migration that you're getting, where you're getting people who are sort of leaving the two major cities and trying to find a kind of more, I guess, a more greater opportunity for peace and freedom, I suppose. And then I was wondering about that, but I was also wondering this. You've used the word vernacular, and in the book, and we'll get to the motivation behind the book, I guess, in a second, but you've used this idea of you talk in the chapter critical adjustment, which is a phrase that Paddy Lynch suggested to you, I think. You say your work is a conscious attempt to appropriate and adapt building traditions that you've observed. Is there a sense, in a way, that this indigenous architecture that you've got, of this timber framed, this very agile timber framed kind of stuff, you're acting in a way to resist its erasure by sort of adapting it in accord with the location, with the context, and with its nature as a form of architecture?
Yeah, I think that is true. There's definitely a conservative streak to what we do, and that's something that we've had to come to terms with. But I think you know, conservatism in architecture often feels like a bit of a dirty word. Mm-hmm. But we've found, you know, as we've gone on this life journey that we spoke about earlier, that as we've matured as architects and as people, we eventually start to get over that initial phase of, you know, wanting to burn the place down, or you know, rebel against the previous generations and, you know, act like little punks. And that's fun and it's great, and it's actually really necessary in the culture. But I think as time has gone on, we looked around us and thought, you know, we looked at what other people were doing in the city, which as a place that feels relatively peripheral, often consists of importing things from elsewhere. So, you know, we get all the same journals that you do, and you know, generation after generation of architects in Brisbane tries to find ways to take what they're seeing in Europe or America or elsewhere in Asia and import that into Brisbane, and sometimes quite uncritically. And it tends to be quite anomalous, which is not always a bad thing, but often it just feels kind of an egocentric way of approaching architecture. And I think I remember we very consciously made a decision early on in the practice that we would try to overcome that urge to want to rebel, to want to sort of rebel for rebellion's sake, I think. So the idea of a critical adjustment, I think, is something that was attractive to us, because it's neither slavishly replicating what has gone on before. It's not conservatism for conservative ends. It's a way of looking and attempting to see value and develop an affection for the place in which you work. And for me, that feels right, because I think as an architect, I want our work to be admired, but I also want it to be liked by as many people as possible, and I want it to have to have a positive impact on the city as a whole. So we felt that the best approach for our practice was to look at Brisbane to think about what Brisbane does well and what Brisbane doesn't do well, what's remarkable about Brisbane and might be different from other kinds of places. And also the ways in which Brisbane is a stuffy, stupid, backward place, like every place can be at different times, and to try and balance those things. And I think sometimes, you know, some people do read that as being a little bit retrograde, but I would like to think that if you look closely at the work, then there is a kind of, to use Lampagani's phrase, a sort of subtle innovation going on, a sort of adherence to a craft tradition that doesn't, and I mean that in the sense of a sort of living tradition, so not a dead tradition, as I said, that slavishly replicates, but one that renews itself by constantly questioning and making these small, subtle, incremental changes. You know, that was the model, and it really all springs from affection, sort of trying to nurture a culture of affectionate observation within the practice. Is that how you see it, Stu?
Yeah, I think that's really important, that one has affection for the place that they work in. I think it's sort of the basic premise of our work, that it's really important to admire the setting as a starting point, as a premise to your work. In a way, it also is self-reflective and talks to self-belief, I guess, and self-acceptance. So again, it's kind of just coming back to the self, because you are ultimately the creator of the work. And it also comes back to the commissions. I mean, our clients are buying these houses because they also admire these buildings. They spend, you know, they pay a lot of money to buy these beautiful, exquisite pieces of carpentry, you know, little 2-bedroom cottages close to the city, center of the city. And so these clients come to us with these commissions, which inherently are about taking care of, you know, the buildings, and becoming custodians on behalf of these clients of the buildings, and making very careful decisions about their futures. And I think it's also about trying to find relevance and meaning in the work in these commissions, because, as Aaron said, in the early years we were attempting and failing to kind of import the work of others that we admired into our own work, and placing these ideas and aesthetics into the backyards of these little cottages. And it was immediately apparent that it was not really working, it was failing. And I think that was, you know, it's so tied into the kind of psyche of the Brisbane psyche, that to have any kind of meaning or relevance in this town as you know, in a creative field, that you either have to leave the city, or that you need to import ideas from elsewhere, that somehow anything that's generated from the town itself is not worthy or meaningful or relevant to a local stage, or even an international stage. So I think very quickly we realized that actually we really needed to kind of dig down into our own spatial histories and our own kind of personal histories, in a way to find self-acceptance, but also to find relevance and meaning in the work that we were doing. So that did mean that you start by admiring the things about these timber buildings that are exquisite, the things that others would find beautiful, the things as architects that we're trained to discover. And then you also realize that actually that's maybe the charge of the architect. That's the remit of the architect in this town, because if we don't lead in the kind of care of these buildings, in this place, in the fabric, then there's probably no one else that's going to.
I think it's a big hurdle for a lot of practitioners, that at some point you have to see what you're doing as legitimate. When you practice in a place that you perceive as being peripheral to the, you know, major cultural centres in the world, sometimes it's about seeing the place in which you're practicing as a legitimate place to practice, a legitimate place to invest in and take inspiration from, and other times it's about perhaps even seeing your own ideas as being legitimate. So I'd like to think that that's probably familiar to lots of people who might be listening to this, that they, particularly if they've been running a practice of some sort, that idea that, oh, this is real and this is valid, I think once you have a sense of that, then you can start to evolve and grow as a practitioner. And for us, that conversation was very much tied to where we were, as much as it was tied to who we were, as Stu was saying.
Yeah, and as much as it has been about taking care of the buildings, it's also been about observing that the city, the character of the city, is really kind of described by delivered through both the object and the field. So the setting itself is vastly low density, and there's a lot of open space, private and public open space in this town. It's historically super low density, and it continues as a capital city in Australia. It continues to have a really low social density and a very low built density as well. So we also realised that the remit wasn't just about taking care of the fabric, the post-colonial fabric, but also taking care of the space between the buildings, the public and private open space, and really beginning to kind of revalue that realm and that territory, not as a viable building site, but actually revaluing it as an empty place. And by empty, I mean having the capacity to be everything and to provide such great amenity to the occupants of the city. And that's, in a way, it sort of starts to speak to what has been a very juvenile post-colonial culture that hasn't seen things that are right in front of their feet. There's still a kind of persistence of this, this notion of terra nullius, that nothing existed. You know, when colonials arrived in this country, they didn't see culture, they didn't see civilization, they couldn't make a proper reading of this place, of this land, and then behaved accordingly. That's starting to shift finally. You know, for what is still a very juvenile culture, we've got a long way to go, but we're slowly shifting with intent towards seeing and thinking and being far more mindful about the place that we build and the place that we occupy. So it's shifting away from these post-colonial kind of timber buildings and cottages and moving towards what is framed as country, as the space in which we occupy the lands and the waters, and taking care of that. And I mean, that's going to be the kind of the crucial thing for the success of the city moving forward, is taking care of the open space in this town, not racing to build over every square meter of country that we have here.
Yeah, that super densification, which can happen, which is happening. In fact, I recorded a podcast earlier today with some scholars who've written a book about that very process, specifically the densification of suburbs, it's a kind of fascinating thing. I mean, that's a political economy discussion about how this kind of leveraged process of suburbanization has now been financialized and packaged up and is causing this super density. But just looking at sort of Brisbane from on the internet and looking at the plan of it, dropping that little yellow man on Google Earth down to look at it, is an extraordinary kind of typology. And you talk about it as suburban, but it's not, as you say, it's not suburban, it's Brisbane. It's like it's something else, isn't it? It's a completely it seems to me to be a completely distinct typology to it in its own right. These kind of lots with detached houses, cheek by jowl, but very few terraces, very few kind of typologies that you would associate with the urban realm, which I find really fascinating. But I was really pleased that you use this term post-colonial, because I was starting to think, and reading the book and listening to you talking, that you're similar to other countries that we perhaps more naturally associate as post-colonial, places like India, West Africa, and so on and so forth. This is a sort of post-colonial discourse, isn't it? The kind of salvaging of the architectural forms that have emerged over the centuries of Australia's modern period, but also trying to find an orientation in that to generate something meaningful for the coming generations.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, there are moments where I guess Aaron and I ask ourselves whether preserving these colonial buildings is the right way forward, whether that's about nostalgia from our own childhoods, our own brief history in time, or whether it's the correct way forward. But I guess one can't just decide to erase a whole town and start again.
That would be a bit naughty. That would be very colonial.
Well, it's very Corbusian in its spirit, I guess.
Exactly. Corbusian and Addis Ababa.
So we are kind of faced with a kind of role as editor in a way, not taking persisting with terra nullius and saying, well, nothing exists. We start with a clean slate, but really acting as in the role as editor and deciding what it is that we edit carefully. What is the intervention to this town moving forward that's going to enable this increase in social density and sustain this increase in density as well. It's not just about building more buildings, it's sustaining the character and responding to the local climate and the local topography. You can't just borrow typology and kind of land it in the city. It needs to be adapted. So
what was your inspiration? I mean, who has been the inspiration? Obviously, most people will know of Glenn Murcutt, and your work has he's been obviously celebrated for creating some forms of sort of an Australian modernist vernacular in a kind of critical regionalist sort of way. Do you see your work as within a continuum of late and postmodernist work, or is there a real turning point and a totally new inflection in what you're doing that is distinct?
To be honest, I think I try and think as little about that as I can in terms of categorizing what we do, at least. The influence of Murcutt specifically is there. I think it permeates all of Australian architectural culture because he's such a big figure. He's not a particularly strong reference for us. We were looking initially more abroad for one thing, at people like Alvarado and Louis Kahn, Alvaro Caesar, Bowles Wilson, and sort of Aussie abroad, a number of practices like that. But locally, we have there's probably another tier of practitioners who are just as esteemed as Glenn is, but they're probably a little less famous outside of Australia. So locally, there's in particular, there's a practice who have now since parted ways, but called Donovan Hill, and they really are. Pardon me. They really are just a phenomenal practice. So they were working at all scales. They began as we have, with alterations and additions to houses, and then sort of matriculated up through the levels to doing towers and all sorts, pretty much every type of building you can imagine. And they were very much the model for us. They were a practice that demonstrated that you could make exceptional buildings, but also make those buildings with ideas, beautiful, poetic, reasoned, thoughtful ideas that you could take a position as a practice. I won't try and describe their work in any detail because I'll do a bad job. Google exists, so I'm sure people will be able to inform themselves. But they were absolutely towering figures in Brisbane when I was a student, and Stu worked for Brian and Timothy briefly as well. So they were hugely important. I think once we actually got on the bike, the practice bike and started pedaling, we tried to, I think like any practice, we were trying to find something that might be a little more uniquely our own. So at that point, we started looking a little bit less at other architects and perhaps a little bit more at buildings that like the Queenslander, for example, or the sort of the landscapes and settings of the city as a form of inspiration, as a way of perhaps reassessing the position that Donovan Hill had taken. Their position, I mean, I was speaking with Timothy Hill recently, and he has a less affectionate view of Brisbane and of Queenslanders. I think certainly a less reverent view of Queenslanders than we would take. I think he described them as woodzies or something. He's quite a amusing, cheeky fellow, as well as being incredibly intelligent and insightful. And I don't necessarily disagree with what he had to say, but I do know that was one area in which our approach differed from theirs. I think that they were able to perhaps and more willing to push back on what Brisbane had been. And I think we looked about us and we saw perhaps more value in the existing fabric of the city. So in many ways, when I think about what our practice is, I see us as a kind of a merger of a sort of an architectural culture, principally, led by the example of Donovan Hill and a few others from abroad, as I mentioned. But a kind of merging of that with a sort of study of a local tradition and the local culture of our city.
I think there's a couple of things going on. I think what might be similar about the work of Glenn Murcutt and Donovan Hill is that I guess they both kind of are focused on the idea of human occupancy. And I think as humanists, their work always appealed to us in equal parts. And I think Glenn's work is really about a study of humans in a landscape. And maybe as scholars, what we found really intriguing and new for ourselves in the work of Donovan Hill is that they kind of brought the scale down to the scale of a room. And they were one of the earlier teachers for us that really talked about room making and the importance of that, and how the act of architecture could be recalibrated down to a single room. And that it was sort of part of their thesis that they might start with a single room and then arrange a building around what they referred to as a memorable room.
One of the things that was certainly very prevalent when we first began practicing in around 2003 was that I think it was the tail end of Murcutt's dominance over the local industry, and there was also what was referred to as the Sunshine Coast School. So the Sunshine Coast is about 150 kilometres north of Brisbane, and in the 90s there was a group of extremely good practitioners who were working in a more Murcutt-esque kind of way. People like Lindsay and Kerry Clare, who were practicing up there, Jeffrey Pye and others. And they were doing really exquisite work. But one of the things that we observed about that was that practitioners in Brisbane were becoming enthused about Murcutt and the Sunshine Coast School and trying to impose that way of practicing in the suburbs of Brisbane. And it didn't work. As Stu said, Murcutt was thinking about, his most celebrated work. He has done sort of inner city work as well, which is excellent, but maybe a little lesser known. But those buildings and landscapes just didn't translate into denser urban environments. They don't have to deal with privacy in the same way. They can't receive breezes and light in the same way. They had to be, I think, more reactive to their setting and their neighbours, and there was a kind of sophistication there that it just wasn't present when they were quite literally translated into a suburban setting, and we found that to be really disappointing. actually. So in addition to finding things to emulate that you really admire, I think there was also this tradition that seemed to be limited and really needed to be reassessed.
Yeah, I mean, it was that pavilion in a landscape that didn't serve us, because a Merket's work, literally would be containers of glass, walls of glass facing north, to receive light and air. And of course, if you do that in a suburban setting, you just expose yourself to your neighbours. So it makes it difficult for one to actually live a life, and get changed in the morning. But I think in a way, it's sort of the work of Donovan Hill allowed us to kind of focus on two things: the room and the garden. So it was the object and the field. It was this constant duality. That's a really nice way to kind of deconstruct what it is that you might think about when you're designing a building. And interestingly, that I think importantly, that it was always coming back to this outdoor space, this open space around the buildings. And it's really where you find the urbanism of the early Brisbane suburb. The urbanism exists in the space between the buildings. Sometimes it's marginal, sometimes it's 1 metre between two cottages, sometimes it's 3 metres, and there's a fruit tree growing up between the houses and branches coming in through the windows. But it's this small margin between the front of the cottage and its front veranda and the street, where neighbour might be walking past and one can have a casual conversation, as you'd imagine in any street, really. But it's this realm between the houses that is where one finds that early urbanism. And I think it's been the place where we've been focusing a lot of our attention in our own work. So making sure that the interventions in these buildings might include kind of making them more porous to the street, making them more porous to their gardens, making them more porous to their neighbours, so that they can start being involved in their broader neighbourhood.
Yeah.
And I think that's where we can start talking about the urbanism of Brisbane, not thinking about houses or buildings in isolation, but thinking about how the cause and effect between buildings and the human occupancy in the space between the building and the street, or between buildings. And I guess our own personal stories, our own memories from childhood kind of play into that as well, because as a child growing up in Brisbane, you spent a lot of time outdoors because the climate is so favourable. It's where all of my earliest memories are, hanging out at the side boundary fence, chatting to the kids next door, for example. And often there were kind of gates between properties, and as kids, you could kind of just wander this collective green space that was left over between all of the houses. But a lot of our memories are in this realm.
But I really like this idea that you talk about, that as practitioners, as a design practice, you see the sort of the cumulative effect of your smaller interventions. So no vast building counted here, in this kind of suburban setting, constitutes a significant piece of civic architecture in its own right, which I think is a most interesting, fantastic idea, a really a wonderful counterpoint to the tendency, certainly over here, and I don't know what it's like in Oz, but the tendency towards massiveness as the only legitimate way of being civic in architecture.
Yeah, I mean, we were in the early days, we were really self-conscious that we were only taking on quite tiny commissions, and commissions that led to little structures in the backyards of these timber cottages. And one can, as an architect, one can develop a complex about that, that we weren't building stadiums, and we weren't building towers in the CBD, and we weren't building, multi-residential projects.
I think you can also, when you're undertaking project work that is seemingly inconsequential, as an architect, sometimes you can relieve yourself of the responsibility that might come with undertaking a project that you perceive as being important.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we felt that really wasn't a great approach to practice, that you should treat every project as if it were legitimate, as if it mattered, as if it had a contribution to make. And perhaps at first, as Stu said, that we started thinking that because we were trying to over-egg the pudding, perhaps, or to to encourage ourselves to feel more important than perhaps we were. But at some point, our former business partner Paul he took an aerial photo of Brisbane, was preparing a talk, and he plotted the position of all the built projects that we had done on it, and we're quite shocked to see how many there were. There was actually this vast proliferation of projects, and okay, each of the dots, so pink dots, so we refer to it as the pink dot map. Each of the pink dots might have just represented a new kitchen, or a pool in the backyard, or a deck extension, or sometimes a new house, or something slightly more substantial. But they added up to something quite vast, and so we started talking about, well, there are probably as many people on a daily basis who would interact with these interventions to the city that we've made as might interact with City Hall or the convention centre, or a major transit exchange or something. So when we started to think about it in that way, we realised that through sustaining a practice over a long period of time, you were having a substantial impact. And at that point, it became not so much about legitimising the work that we were doing in our own minds, and became more of a realisation that it actually does matter, and you have a responsibility to treat every piece of work that you do in the city as something that matters, and as if it has an impact on the city. It is a city-making project.
Yeah, there was a lot of squandering going on of what we had in this city. I think built fabric and the open space was seen as a building site that you could just build anything on, particularly in the suburbs.
Yeah,
there was a race to the centre, into the CBD of Brisbane, and apparently all of the important and clever people in the Brains Trust worked in the centre, and the inner suburban and outer suburban realm of Brisbane was left to those, without much care. And there was a lot of squandering there always has been, and I think we recognise that as well, that it's really important for the preservation of the character of the city, but that one actually takes care of suburbia, and no one was really talking about neighbourhoods and suburbia at the time that we really started to kind of hold it, to embrace it.
And that behaviour was amplified by what you're referring to earlier, Ambrose, the gentrification that was coming with this influx of new people to the city, and this influx of money into the city as well. So much of the work that was going on was taking little cottages. I think Stu alluded to this earlier. Taking a little cottage and quadrupling the size of it, lifting it, putting cars underneath, building a pool in the backyard, filling out every last square inch of the lot that it was sitting on with these massive gargantuan buildings. And we had to ask ourselves, what are we gaining by doing this, and what are we losing? And in our opinion, was that we were squandering the very thing that made Brisbane remarkable in the first place, which was the outdoors, this access to these amazing verdant gardens. And I think one of the legitimate criticisms of the position that we take is, by preserving these vernacular houses in these large lots, are we standing in the way of a more, perhaps a denser, more equitable distribution of space in the city, or a more urbane kind of a city? But the position that we've taken is that we're not necessarily for or against anything, but we recognise that the Queenslander is probably here to stay for another century or more. And if we're going to have this building stock as, constituting a large part of our city, we ought to preserve the things about it that make it worthwhile. And that is both recognising the building for the attributes that it has, but more importantly, recognising its relationship to the street, its relationship to the garden, and all of the events and activities that take place around it. Not just turn these things into giant McMansions that are introverted, asocial buildings that are designed for maximal convenience, that are designed for maximum, in inverted commas, luxury, but actually don't really deliver any sustaining or sustainable pleasures for the people who live in these communities, or even in the houses themselves ultimately. You know, I think often a lot of the work that's being done to buildings in the process of gentrification in the city is actually just trying to soothe a sort of broader societal ailment, you know, that we all work too much, that we're all too isolated from one another, that we're losing touch with nature, and you know, we're working too much, we're consuming too much, etc., etc. You know, it's a symptom. It's a kind of pathology that we need to question and push back on. And look, architecture is not the solution to that, and certainly our practice and our practice's work is not the solution for it either. But you know, it's part of the conversation that we wanted to have by producing the book, and you know, to have with other people in Brisbane, other practitioners and students, but also, I guess, to put it out into the world and see whether there are people in other parts of the country or other parts of the world with whom these ideas resonate. And I suppose we're in the process of finding that out.
Yeah, I think that's a really important kind of thing for people to hear. I mean, I've worked in practices where there's been it's largely private residential, and as a sort of young trainee architect, you kind of you champ at the bit a little bit, partly because the training is so object orientated rather than this reciprocity that you're talking about, this idea of room making in the garden. And you talked about the sort of the relationship of the interior of the building to the street and to the city beyond, but it also goes the other way around, doesn't it? That the city then starts inflecting the nature of the spaces within it. But so how do you work this out? You write very beautifully and speak very beautifully in some of the transcripts in Migrations from Memory about what I think an anthropologist might describe as ethnography, like the way that you encounter the building, the street, and the client is a kind of a slow and sort of dedicated process of kind of unpicking values, needs, and then sort of relating them back to this typology, this suburban typology that you're working with. I mean, maybe you could explain how you do it. Like, is it a quick process? Is it a slow process? Is that at the heart of it, a kind of taking your time?
I think it's both, Ambrose. In one sense, it's very quick because in the nature of our practice is that our fees are low, and if we want to sustain our business, we have to work really rapidly. So I think one of the traits of our practice has been that we generate the work very, very quickly on a project by project basis. But there's also this other overarching thematic in the work, which is being explored over a much longer narrative arc, you might say. So while we might be working through the individual projects quite rapidly because they're repeated, because we're getting similar commissions over and over again, there's knowledge that's passed on from one project to another, and the way that what I'm aware of is that in addition, or rather in parallel to the project work, there's a kind of conversation that's been going on now for 20 years between Stu and I and other people that we collaborate with and with our clients, where we're constantly referring back to projects that we've already done, talking about our experiences in the city, places that we've been elsewhere, relating all of the things that we experience as architects and just as people getting around the city and the country and the world, and trying to make sense of it. And a lot of the essays in the book, I think, come out of that practice. of reflecting and storytelling, and so that's really where the thinking is done. And there are certain disciplines that I think have also informed it, such as, you know, we've measured and drawn hundreds of houses now. You know, this is the first thing that we have to do in a commission, is go out and measure a building and come back to the office and make a set of drawings that represent the building that we've just measured. And all of those things, all of those experiences, I think what they amount to is a very slow realization of that reciprocity between a space and a drawing. And that's really, for me, what architecture is about. It's about experiencing the world, finding a way to abstract and distill that into a diagram of a building, i.e. a floor plan, or a set of drawings that can evoke or replicate an atmosphere that you've experienced before and you're trying to find again. So for me, the measure drawing process is super important, because we've had this consistent discipline of going to a space, speaking to people about how they live in the space, looking at where the furniture is and where they've cut a hole in the wall, where they've hung a painting, how the light comes in, whether it's a shitty space or enriching, uplifting space, and then making a drawing of it. And when you look at that drawing and you think about your thoughts and feelings about being in the space, you start to make those connections. And over time, I think you get better at then generating the drawing first in order to create the atmosphere that you're looking for, or the relationship, or enable the kind of occupation that you imagine might take place. So I think one of the problems, or the sort of misnomers of that you pick up as a student when you're training to be an architect, is that I think sometimes you imagine that a building is capable of more than it is. That, you know, the way that we speak about buildings often in the crits, or in a design studio, is to act as if the building is doing the thing that we claim that it's doing. It's the building that's generating the civility. It's the building that's making all of these things happen. But I think maybe we need to revisit that just a little bit and think and remind ourselves that the things that happen that actually matter, they're enacted by people. The kind of civility in the street or the suburb or the neighborhood, the agent of that is the people who live in the buildings and live in the neighborhood. And the building has a role to play in that, of course. The building is influencing the way that people might feel, and it may prohibit or enable certain behaviours to take place. But really all it's doing is trying to encourage certain types of outcomes. It can't actually do the doing of those behaviours. It can't cause two neighbours to have a conversation. It can really only encourage it. And so I guess if you think about architecture in that way, then you start to think about buildings more as Timothy Hill has put it in the past, buildings and spaces anticipating occupation. They're predicting, but they're not prescribing how spaces will be used. So really, I mean, I'm probably rambling a little now, but all of those themes seem to be connected in my mind. This idea that the way that you learn architecture is just by being in the world and experiencing things and reflecting on them. In our case, writing about them through the book, but also making drawings of them, and just practicing this discipline of trying to understand how a drawing and a space relates, but also thinking about what a building does. How is it participating in these situations? What is its role? Is something great happening despite the building, or is it happening with the assistance of the building? Is it more likely to happen because a topology in a city is configured in a particular way? And what are those aspects of that topology that actually contribute, and what are the parts of the building that are just kind of peripheral to the thing that the building does that's important?
just coming back to your point about the connections between people, and this being the kind of the moment of urbanism, I think, in the city, it becomes really apparent that the connections that we make between ourselves and others are kind of more important than the buildings. It's almost like the relationship that we have with our client, the commission that we take on, is more important, and the building that we make together with our client is just a byproduct of making a really intimate connection with those people and spending. I mean, it sounds awfully wanky, I guess, but it almost feels like it's a moment in time that we have together with our clients that's more important, that we learn about each other, and the building is just a thing that comes out the other end. And it also became very apparent to me that we get to the end of the commission with a client, and I would think, wow, wouldn't it be great if we got together and did another project? Or, you know, wouldn't it be great if at this point in time we were able to start that whole process again? Because we know each other so intimately. We know everything about our preferences, our predilections, our partners, our children, you know, our past, our future, our hopes and dreams. And in a way that kind of prompted us to sit down with a client who came to us with a Queenslander they just bought. He's a prolific writer and a very successful author, grew up in Brisbane. And we sat with him and his wife in the first meeting, and he said, "Oh, okay, so Stu, how do we start this thing?" And I said, "Well, you know, we're just going to spend a lot of time with you over the next couple of years, and we're just going to get to know each other really well and share stories with each other. Really, that's going to be the kind of experience in this commission. So instead of giving us a list of rooms that you'd like us to design and include in your building, why don't we advance this relationship, and why don't you begin by sharing stories with us about you and your family and your past and your future?" And it was a really wonderful document. I mean, knowing that he's a great writer, we knew that he was up to the task, and his wife is equally clever. And what came back was this beautiful collection of short stories captured under a room name or an event that was going to happen in their house, or I think there was a little short story about their dog. And John and Jane just shared these most wonderful little anecdotes and you know, pieces of history and with us about their lives and their preferences. And it became the most evocative way to receive a brief from a client, and became something that we have since formalized with all of our clients. This request at the beginning that our clients would prepare a suite of narratives as a way of giving us a brief. And it's the closest we can get to, I guess, what you would call cultural anthropology. You know, it's the closest we can get to living with them for 6 months, which would be even better, or maybe unbearable. But
definitely unbearable.
To really understand the motivations of your client as a way of evoking the kind of building and the connections between rooms and the relationship to the garden, or their preference for light, or their preference to wake in a dark room, or, you know, whatever it might be. Such an evocative way to begin thinking about a building. And that's been really successful. You know, it's really tuned ourselves, our clients, our staff into thinking about occupancy and anticipating occupancy in the way in which a building plays that role. And I think it's been really great.
Yeah, it's a very beautiful sort of, and it's not anti-modernist is not the right word. There's perhaps not, because postmodernist isn't also the right word, but there, you know, it's a, and you see this in the images that I've seen and the plans and drawings and photographs I've seen of your work, which is they're very, very person-centered, individual centered, rather than this modernist tendency towards the avatar, the kind of le modular, the kind of standard 6 foot tall, 1.8 meter tall male avatar for a human being. And I think that's really an amazing shift, and a very significant shift in the way that architecture could possibly address some of the kind of crises that are in front of us, with without wishing to use bleak and blank words like unsustainable, but the way that architecture is certainly, or urban development is certainly not producing successful cities, not producing successful places, but to start with this idea of the person and then build out from that. And your architecture looks like that from where I'm sat. It looks like the heart of the person is the starting point, which is truly elegant.
Thank you. It does speak to sustainability in so much that it allows us to really challenge how much building we make.
Yeah.
As a way of accommodating the stories, the client's stories. It allows us to not ask for solutions. So a lot of clients want to jump into delivering a brief which is about describing a possible solution. And we're constantly saying to a client, let's not talk about solutions. Let's talk about what, I guess you used the word problem. What's the design problem? Although that seems kind of strange that you talk about problem in this sort of privileged, affluent society that we live in. No one really has a problem if they're at the architect's office, really. Let's face it.
Other than the architect.
That sounds to me like you talk yourself out of big commissions towards small commissions, which is a terrible business plan.
Well, not really. I mean, the kind of use of narrative has also been really successful with non-residential clients, single house commissions. And in a way that it seems more obvious that you would deploy that with organizations as clients, that you start to kind of dig down into their culture, their business culture and their corporate culture. That seems pretty obvious, but it works in the same way. One really needs to understand the organization as a group of people, not just the list of rooms and the spatial requirements of the space data that normally gets delivered as a brief for a bigger building, for a non-residential building.
So why, to go right back to the beginning and to finish, why migrations from memory? What does the title of the book mean? I mean, I think I can discern it, but perhaps there's something there.
Well, Patrick came up with the title, so you might have to refer to
ask him.
No, well, I mean, we can tell you what we think it refers to. I mean, it was something that came out of a conversation that we had with Patrick, an email exchange that's published in the book, that was first published in the Journal of Civic Architecture that Patrick's been running for a few years. I think he recognised something in the way that we were working, the way that we were drawing upon, as Stu's alluded to in this conversation, our childhoods, our spatial histories, as Leon van Skyke might put it, and how we were taking and using memory as the basis of an architecture. I would like to think a more kind of human-centric architecture, a way of sort of reconfiguring or resetting our focus away from fashions and styles and images of buildings and trying to generate an architecture out of observations of occupancy, or observations about things that seem to have greater resonance with the people who occupy buildings, and perhaps less resonance with the kind of dialogue that seemed to be in the ascendancy 20 years ago, which is much more perhaps form driven and superficial in its nature. That never really connected with us. We probably couldn't have articulated why, but we felt that there was another way of practicing architecture that would feel more legitimate and be more meaningful and enduring, particularly given that they're not the kind of commissions that we were ever going to get in this city. We were never going to be doing extremely well-funded gallery spaces or buildings that could be held up as trophies or landmarks. This is a city with an abundance of commissions, as Stu said, but there are an abundance of commissions for more ordinary things. And we were seeking to find a way to make remarkable ordinary things that people would value and cherish. So really, it was about a reorientation and trying to find a way to practice that would facilitate working in that way.
Well, I think it's my role to accept that answer at this point.
In which case, we'll leave it there. Thank you ever so much. That was really wonderful.
Yeah, thanks, Ambrose.
That's all, folks. See the podcast description for links to Vokes and Peters' website, a couple of other things they have out there on a couple of their recent homes, links to the book Migrations from Memory, and to Aaron and Stu's social media. Thanks for listening.